Hello and welcome to day 2 of Zoology Live 2021. I'm Ros Wade, I'm the Learning Officer here at the Museum of Zoology, and I'll be your guide this week as we explore animals of land, sea and sky. So if you missed day 1, fear not, you can catch up on YouTube and discover wildflower meadows and the insects that make a living in cowpats. You can also find out how to take part in our Cowpat About Cambridge challenge, collecting information about the dung beetles that are found, you guessed it, in cowpats. But today we're going to be diving into the world's oceans, starting with a journey to warmer climes and to tropical coral reefs with marine biologist Dr. Katie Dunkley. She'll be joining us live to answer your questions, so do pop them in the comments. We'll then give you a sneak peek at our temporary exhibition opening next week as artist Mella Shaw talks about her work inspired by the issue of plastics in the ocean. This piece has itself inspired our own Protests Plastics Challenge, and we'll be showing you how to take part in that as well. We'll then be looking at some of the undersea creatures on display in the museum, starting with our magnificent fin whale skeleton. We will be joined live by our collections manager, Matt Lowe, who is ready to answer your questions about this amazing skeleton. We'll finish with a bit of a treat, as some of our wonderful volunteers here share their favourite sea creatures with us. So coral reefs are amazingly diverse habitats found in warm, shallow seas. They are colourful and complex, supporting thousands upon thousands of species of fish, molluscs, crustaceans, worms and loads more. It's no wonder they caught the interest of our first guest, Dr. Katie Dunkley. Here she introduces these important ecosystems, after which she'll be joining us live to answer your questions, so do make sure you pop them in the comments.
Hi, I'm Dr. Katie Dunkley, a marine biologist here at the University of Cambridge. I spend my time studying the fish that live on coral reefs, which are usually found in the clear, shallow and warm bath-like waters of the tropics, like the Caribbean and Australia. Coral reefs are like the rainforest of the sea. They're colourful and busy underwater cities, providing homes and food to over a quarter of all sea life. That means that thousands of different animal species can be found living on one reef. One group of important fishes that you'll see on a reef are the parrotfish. These fish use their parrot-like beaks to bite and scrape algae, which is a type of seaweed, off rocks and dead coral. Parrotfish then grind up the inedible bits of coral and poop it out as sand. So that means that the fine white sand you see on tropical beaches could be made from parrotfish poo. Cleaner fish are also another important animal living on coral reefs, and I've spent a lot of my time studying them. These small fish help keep the other fish healthy by eating parasites and dead skin from their bodies. The most important thing on coral reefs, though, is the coral itself. Corals may look like colourful rocks, but they're actually animals. Corals are made from a collection of tiny animals called polyps living inside a hard rock-like skeleton. This means that a big coral that we see on a reef is made up of thousands of polyps growing together. So corals can grow in all shapes and sizes and at quite a slow speed. So massive boulder-like corals, for example, can grow up to 2 centimetres a year, which is a bit slower than your fingernails grow, whilst the branching tree-like corals are a bit faster at around 10 centimetres a year, and this is a bit slower than your hair grows. As corals grow together, they form a reef. Some coral reefs grow so big, like the Great Barrier Reef, that we can even see it from space. Now, because corals grow really slowly, that means the reefs we see today are thousands of years old. So if they're damaged and lost, they'll take a very long time to come back. As corals grow upwards and outwards, they form underwater cities, which provide holes, cracks and crevices for all sorts of animals to live in, including shrimps, crabs, snails and small fishes. These smaller animals feed the bigger fish, which in turn feed the even bigger fish like sharks. So this makes coral reefs one of the busiest places in the ocean, full of marine life. Without corals, all the animals that live on the reefs would lose their homes and disappear from our seas. Coral reefs aren't just important for marine life though, they're also very important for people too. So around 500 million or 500 million people rely on reefs for a source of food and money. So that's more people that rely on reefs than live in America. Now, coral reefs can also protect our coastline by stopping powerful waves hitting the shore. And new medicines have been discovered from animals and plants living on reefs to treat cancer and infections and to help stop severe pain. So like animals, we need coral reefs, but unfortunately our actions are also causing damage to coral reefs. Rising ocean temperatures from climate change and pollution are causing coral to become damaged and to die. When the water gets too hot or too polluted, corals get damaged by something called bleaching. Bleaching is when corals turn white and they stop being able to make food. Seawater is also becoming more acidic from climate change, which is causing corals to grow even slower than usual. Our actions are not just damaging the coral itself though. We're also catching too many fish from reefs in one go. We call this overfishing. If we catch too many fish at once, the remaining fish cannot reproduce and recover quick enough. So overfishing is wiping out fish like sharks and tuna and disrupting the delicate balance of animal species living on reefs. So how can we help save coral reefs? Well, people including scientists are working hard to rebuild and protect coral reefs. We can plant small bits of coral, like you would with trees, to grow more coral, which is called coral gardening. We can also make fake corals, which we call artificial reefs. These artificial reefs can then be put into the sea and provide a home for fish and other small animals and plants. Finally, with the help of governments, we're also protecting reefs and big areas of the sea with marine protected areas. These areas protect fish from fishing and other human activities. We can't save the reefs though without your help too. To help stop overfishing, try to only eat sustainable seafood. The Marine Conservation Society has a good fish guide, which can help tell you which fish are okay to eat. Also try to use less water, as this will reduce the amount of pollution entering the oceans. Finally, try to learn as much as you can about coral reefs and talk to your family and friends. Tell them about coral reefs, the rainforests of the sea, and explain why they are important and what challenges they now face.
I'm joined now by Dr. Katie Dunkley. Hello, Katie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, to start off, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm interested in. So, what is it about coral reefs that really first got you interested in them?
I think I'm just fascinated by sort of the diversity of species that are on a reef and just how many different colourful fish you see. My first experience with a reef was when I learnt to dive, and at first I thought I was going to be quite terrified of all the animals that were just around me, but actually it was just mesmerising.
Wow. So, can you describe a little bit about your research for us?
Sure. So I study the interactions that occur between different coral reef fish. So previously I spent a lot of time studying cleaning behaviour, which is where a small fish removes parasites and sort of other debris from the body of another fish. So they can kind of keep the reef fish healthy by removing these parasites. And I looked at why they cleaned different fish and what caused them to clean as well.
Right, so, there's so many interactions going on in coral reefs. What is it that makes them so diverse and got such an amazing number of species and different behaviours that we can see there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I think that's puzzled scientists for a long time, and some recent research has shown that it's kind of just down to how old coral reefs are, and therefore over time they've just gained lots of species, and it's just accumulated over this really long time scale. So that's why it's really important, where if we lose reefs and lose the diversity of species that are on reefs, it's going to take a really long time to recover.
Yeah. So we've got a few questions coming in from our audience that I think would be really great to get your answers from. So how many coral fish underwater animal species are there? That is a big question.
Yeah, that's a lot is the short answer. To kind of put that into perspective, there's around 6,000 species of coral alone, just across the world reefs. So there's huge numbers.
Masses of species is the answer to that one. So you talk about coral bleaching in your film. I've got a question here. Did you know that a lot of coral bleaching is caused by animal agriculture? Is that the case?
Animal what, sorry?
Agriculture. I'm guessing that's because
yeah.
Climate change is quite impacted by that.
Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why corals bleach, and climate change is one of them, but also pollution and sort of nutrients runoff from sort of farming and fertilisers. It causes the environment to become stressed. It changes the water clarity, which is very important for corals, and also changes the temperature of the water as well. So yeah, there's quite a number of reasons why corals bleach.
What's actually going on when a coral bleaches? What is it? Because it looks so dramatic. What's happening to make them lose their colours that way?
Yeah, so corals, the polyps that sort of form corals have what we call zooxanthellae living under their tissue. Now, zooxanthellae is an algae, and it forms a symbiosis with the coral. So a symbiosis is where two species form a close association and both benefit. Now, these algae essentially provide the food for the coral. So they provide food by photosynthesizing, so creating energy from light. And this provides a source of food for the coral. Now, when coral becomes stressed, it essentially expels this algae from its tissue. So without this algae, first of all, the coral loses its colour, so the algae is responsible for the colour. But also without this algae, they don't have any food, which means then they're unable to, they don't have any energy, they don't have any food. And if they can regain algae again in a relatively short time period, the coral then can then survive. But if it can't get hold of any more algae, then it starves to death essentially.
So I've got a slightly more cheerful question for you now. I've got two people who've asked a similar one. So Sumi and Henry have both asked what your favourite species of fish is, and Henry also asks, where is your favourite place to dive?
Gosh, they're great questions. So my favourite species of fish, I really like a collection of species, or a family of fish called the territorial damselfish. And why I like these fish is they essentially cultivate or grow little algae farms on the reef. And then they aggressively defend these little territories or their algae farms from intruding fish species through chasing them and through biting. So I just think they're quite fun, really. And in terms of best place to dive, I've been super lucky to be able to visit various places, but I was very excited to visit and dive on the Great Barrier Reef, because it's one of those reefs that you obviously hear so much about. So to actually dive there was very special.
Sounds amazing. So Karen asks, why do fish like coral reefs? What is it about coral reefs that fish like?
Oh, that's a great question. So I guess there's a number of reasons. So coral reefs, first of all, because they're so diverse and they're so complex, all the structures, they then create homes for the smaller fish, which then provide a source of food for the larger fish. But these homes and these structures also create shelter, so fish can use them, for example, as a nursery for their young. It's also a great place, for example, to find a mate as well. So yeah, I guess there's a variety of reasons.
Yeah. So Lila asks, what is the benefit of studying fish on a reef? I mean, it sounds like a lot of fun, but are there other benefits to studying fish on a reef?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so from my perspective, as I said, I study the interactions that occur between species. And these interactions are very important because they kind of shape how reef fish live on a reef. So all fish, for example, are connected to one another in their interactions, and that's really important for creating a healthy reef. But also, for example, the parrotfish are very important on a reef in terms of how they keep the reef healthy. So they remove algae from the corals, and if there becomes too much algae in a reef, it essentially smothers the coral and then leads again to its bleaching and its death. So again, these fish are very important. So not only do the corals play a big part in creating a healthy environment, but also the fish kind of do as well. Without fish or without coral, a reef's not a healthy place.
Yeah, it sounds very, very complex and complicated system there. Yeah. So Roberto asks, is there a specific reason why the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is so much bigger than others?
Oh gosh, that's a very good question. To be honest, I'm not sure. I think coral, because it's very specific in terms of the conditions that it needs to live in. So in terms of the water clarity, the light, the sort of water conditions as well. I imagine the area around where the Great Barrier Reef is just a good spot for growing corals. Good water temperature as well, for example.
Yeah. Freya asks, is there any species of fish you've looked at that has a certain behaviour that strikes you as really different and interesting?
That's a good question. So I would say that cleaning is a very unique interaction for coral reefs. So cleaning is found mostly. So you're most likely to find cleaning on a coral reef. There's not. It occasionally happens in other places, but it's not a daily. So fish visit cleaner fish on a daily basis, multiple times a day. So it's a really, really common interaction there. But in other places, you rarely see it.
Yeah. Had another question. Is coral also affected by the acidity of water?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the acidity of water is very important for coral. So coral, the hard structure that kind of forms the reef is calcium carbonate or chalk. And if the water is too acidic, it stops coral from growing as well. And so coral grows a lot slower when the reefs are more acidic. And it's also thought that if the reefs become too acidic, coral will actually start to dissolve.
Oh gosh, that's very sad. Yeah. Lada asks, what are the most rare species of coral and fish, and what are they called?
Oh gosh, that's a very good question. Rare, so I guess an answer that I want to give to that is not quite rare, but in terms of something that you used to see a lot back before I was even diving on reefs was a lot of sharks, for example. And sharks are now actually quite rare on many coral reefs because of overfishing and things. So actually, you don't often see sharks now on reefs, which is very sad.
Yeah. Shilpa asks, and this is a really good question, I like this, what made you get into marine biology and what path did you take after your GCSEs?
Great question. So I actually went into marine biology because I was fascinated by whales and dolphins. And it was, so after my GCSEs, I went to A-level and focused on science, so biology and some chemistry, as well as maths. I then went to the University of Plymouth to study marine biology, which is where I then was really lucky. I got to visit Indonesia and work on a coral reef, and that's where I became fascinated with the reef fish behaviour. So again, then that's how I then moved into that area. So
that sounds great. Bluebell would like to know how long it takes for the coral to bleach white.
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's relatively quick. So it's only recently been filmed bleaching, and it happens quite quickly because the coral essentially, or the polyps essentially, just expel or spit out that algae. It's then, if these bleaching, and it's then, as I said, whether they can get the algae or the zooxanthellae back again, and if they can't, that's when they die. But when they do get this zooxanthellae back, they're thought to not then recover as quickly. So then if there's another bleaching event quite close together, they then get hit again, and then they really suffer. So Yeah,
It's a bad thing. It's a big bad thing. Madeline asks, does coral have any form of consciousness? Gosh, that's quite an interesting question.
oh, that is an interesting question. I would probably say not. It's quite highly debated whether many animals have a form of consciousness, and that's more kind of your top mammals, so dolphins and whales, for example. But great question.
Yeah. So Jetha asks, and got a bit of an international audience, I think. Jetha asks, in Sri Lanka, the coral reefs are damaged because the ships that contain oil have been burned, and many of the turtles washed up to the beaches. So is it a damage for biodiversity? So I guess is that, when you have these sort of accidents at sea and things like that, does that damage the biodiversity on coral reefs?
Yes, yeah. So again, that's another human impact that can have big consequences for marine life. And I think it's in those cases, for example, in oil, it's where the oil smothers animals and stops them carrying out their sort of day-to-day activities. Yeah, definitely.
Noah, age 7, wants to ask, what animals eat coral?
Great question. So there's actually something called a crown of thorns starfish that is a very big coral predator, and they're a real problem if the population or the number of starfish on a reef grows out of control, because they can really eat away at the coral quite heavily, and they're a big problem.
So another question, I think we've already answered this a bit, but are coral reefs alive? I think the answer to that is
yes.
Yeah.
What, coral reefs are alive? Sorry. So what?
Yeah.
So exactly. So coral reefs are definitely alive. Corals are they've kind of been described as a mixture of a plant, animal, and a mineral. The polyps themselves are animals; they're alive, and then they've got the algae, so the plant living inside the polyps, and then the hard calcium carbonate or the chalk structure is then the mineral. But yes, very much alive.
Yes. But Morgan asks, can you make man-made reefs?
Yeah, excellent question. And yes, so that's what a lot of scientists are trying to do at the moment. So they're creating man-made structures that resemble corals, but also, for example, sinking a boat and creating a complex surface for corals to kind of grow on is also an option as well. So creating man-made artificial reefs is definitely what scientists are working on at the moment, as well as gardening and trying to grow existing reef as well.
Yeah. So Julia, age 9, asks, what are the natural colours in coral reefs?
What are the natural what, sorry?
Colours.
So great question. So colour on a coral comes from the algae that lives inside it, which is why it turns white when the algae is expelled. And then because the corals are so colourful, one of the reasons why the reef fish are so colourful is then they camouflage with the coral, and it helps them, for example, hide from predators. Coral reef fish can also be colourful to act as a warning to say sort of, hey, don't eat me, I might hurt you. So that's another reason why coral reef fish are colourful as well. But I think it's one of the colours on the reef are what makes them so vibrant and exciting as well.
Yeah. So Irina asks, is there a certain depth of water that coral reefs live at, and can they survive at any depth?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so corals tend to be in shallow waters because they're relying on the algae that lives in their tissues for sunlight. So they definitely need to be able to have light reach them. There are deep sea corals which don't get their food from algae living inside their tissues, but most corals are in the sunlight for sure.
And that links to a question from Jean, who asks, are there any reefs or reef equivalents in colder waters? Because we've been looking at tropical ones.
Great question. So there is actually a reef off the coast of the UK, a cold water coral reef, which again is made from sort of a chalk or calcium carbonate structure. So although most coral reefs are found in warmer waters, you do get cold water species as well, which are usually not very well studied, I believe.
Okay. So I don't think we can answer all of your questions because they've got quite a lot, but we'll have, I think, maybe another 3. So Julia, age 9, asks, how long do polyps live for?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Not sure. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. Just that corals themselves are very old. So the Great Barrier Reef, for example, is 8,000 years old, but I don't think the polyps live for that long. I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay, that's it. Maybe Julia, you'd like to go and do some research on that one. So Jude and Sydney ask, how does coral reproduce?
Great question. So coral is quite special in the way it reproduces. So it can reproduce, and first of all, it can make clones of itself, which is why you can garden, or you can take fragments of coral and grow it in other places. But they also reproduce by doing this something called broadcast spawning, where they essentially produce their eggs and their sperm, and they just put it into the water, and then it mixes, and that only happens once sort of on one night in a given time period, and so they're quite spectacular when they reproduce, I think.
Yeah. So Madeline asks, my teacher told us that sharks have to move to be able to breathe because they must ram ventilation. But Clint from Clint's Reptiles said this was false, which is true.
Sharks, they mostly have to move to, so some species of shark don't. So some reef shark you see sort of sat on the seabed, but most of the sort of the bigger sharks, they do need to, they move to survive,
Yeah. So your teacher, a bit of both with that one, nobody's totally wrong. Okay. And one last question from Shilpa. If we ever did bring back any popular breeds of prehistoric fish or marine life, would it ever affect our ocean right now?
Gosh, yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that's one of the things that I'm sort of working on is how differences in which fish are around affect, for example, how species interact with each other, and whether the dominant species at one time point then has an effect and changes, for example, the interaction. And certainly different fish can have big influences on whether they're there or not. So, yeah, brilliant question.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's been really fascinating and such an amazing kind of habitat to learn more about. So thank you so much for joining us today, Katie.
It's okay, thanks for having me.
So coral reefs show us clearly how our actions are affecting the world's oceans. One of the human impacts on the seas that has received quite a bit of attention in recent years is the issue of ocean plastics. And this issue has inspired one of the artists who's featured in our summer exhibition, and I met with her online last week to find out more. So I'm joined now by artist Mela Shaw. Hello, Mela.
Hello.
Could you tell us a little bit about the exhibition Breaking Point that's coming to the museum this summer?
Yeah, great. Thank you for inviting me. So the exhibition is called Breaking Point, Fragility in Clay and Nature. And I think it opens on the 8th of July and runs until the 3rd of October. Basically, we've brought together 3 artists for this exhibition, myself and Elspeth Owen and Jane Ivamy. Elspeth's piece is called Making Do, and her work is very much about a direct response to this idea of the fragility of the earth and also the fragility of clay as a material, and particularly fired ceramics. So she's responding to an elephant bird's egg that was actually collected by Sir David Attenborough when he was a young man, and he found all these shards and then he pieced them back together into this perfect egg. So we've borrowed that object because it's in his private collection, which is lovely, and shown alongside that, Elspeth's work is sort of small fragments of broken shards, which will be scattered through the museum, and her own version of the egg. So it's very much drawing attention to this idea of how things can be salvaged and put back together, and particularly at this point of climate crisis. It's a really, actually quite an optimistic and hopeful piece, which is lovely. And then we've got Jane Ivamy, whose work is drawing attention to the number of British birds on the endangered red list, the red list of endangered species. And her work is extremely moving. And basically the species on that red list, they've had at least 50% of their breeding populations decline. So yeah, it's a very sad and poignant piece. And we'll be showing that alongside actual bird skins from the collection as well. So yeah, really just to say that the whole concept of the exhibition was to get to show our ceramic pieces that are drawing attention to these issues, but within the zoology collection and the amazing kind of specimens that are there, and to kind of revitalize these conversations, I suppose, because of those two sitting next to each other. So then I'm showing two bodies of work. The one I'll talk most to you about, and I think you probably have more questions about, is Harvest. But before I mention that, I'll just mention the other body, which is called Janus forms. So there's a series of forms, and this is an example of one. They are made, the god Janus obviously had two faces, one looking to the past and one looking to the future. So again, these are sort of seen to be representing ecosystems because they're in perfect balance. But they also kind of represent, again, this moment of time that we're in, where we're in this key point where of transition from the past to the future, and how we're actually going to have to deal with this and start taking notice of the environmental moment in time. So Harvest is quite a large scale ceramic installation that I started making in 2017. I read a statistic from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that by 2050 there'll be a greater weight of plastic in the ocean than fish. And reading that statistic is obviously absolutely horrifying. I think we've all become a bit, more used to those kind of very dramatic statistics now. But when I first read that, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, can that really be true? And one of the reasons I felt that was because it's a statistic based on weight, not volume. And obviously everybody knows that, the weight of a fish is much more than the weight of plastic. So I decided to literally make that statistic kind of physical so that people could see it and hopefully have a more emotional, dramatic response to it. So what I did was I made a huge number of ceramic fish and ceramic examples of plastic. So this is one of the examples of this is slip cast ceramic, so it's quite light. And this is an example of the fish. So the fish have also been smoke fired, but I made literally hundreds of these. And the idea is if you hold one of the plastic containers in your hand and you hold the fish in the other hand, the fish is much heavier. It's been made in a different way, but the fish is roughly represents how the weight of an average sort of herring size fish. And this is roughly, it's slightly heavier, but it's basically the weight of plastic. So it meant that I made an enormous amount more of the plastic, the ceramic plastic. And so when you see the installation, it is quite dramatic as a representation of that statistic.
Numbers are always so huge that it feels a bit mind-boggling, and having work like this is so important to put it in context really for us so that we can get a bit of a grip, try and get a bit of a grip about it.
But it was very much for me, and I think for the other two artists as well, we're very interested in connecting through art to an emotional response that people have about these statistics and these very scientific information that we're given, but trying to make it a bit more approachable and understandable. And also to connect people in a very personal way to it, so that they feel that they have some, personal autonomy and can do something about it. So for me, I've only got two examples here, but I made about 32 different molds. But the idea was that these are very recognized, like we can tell that this is a very obvious milk bottle, and I've got spray guns and all the kind of obvious things that we all use around the house. So you feel actually quite personally connected because these are objects that you use every day.
Over the last kind of year and a half, as we've been going through such challenging times, I don't know about you, I feel like these issues, they feel like they've dropped off the agenda somewhat. There have been so many big topics that we've had to engage with. Do Do you think it's our relationship with single-use plastics has changed?
Yeah, I think unfortunately and inevitably it has, because of the kind of medical crisis that we've been in. And it's actually quite interesting because this exhibition was planned for a year ago, and obviously we had to postpone it by a full year. And in a way, it has brought my installation, the harvest piece, kind of back more into the focal point, because I think a lot of people are beginning to realize that actually we need to get back to thinking more environmentally about single-use. PPE particularly obviously has become a big issue, and I mean, it is very distressing. I think anecdotally everybody has seen a lot of disposable masks and plastic gloves left all over the place, and the problem is that no matter how they're disposed, ultimately they will end up in the oceans because of the way landfill doesn't work, basically. So yeah, it is distressing, and I think that what's wonderful is a lot of people are very frustrated by this, and hopefully that will push the issue back up the agenda, really. But yeah, it's definitely a worrying time right now for lots of reasons. And I mean, obviously the main, I think there is so much that needs to be done in terms of plastic pollution, and a main way of doing that is to put pressure on businesses and companies and supermarkets and all of that, and we can all do that in our own small way.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point you make as well about, even though it seems like such a huge issue, individually we can make a difference. And I think that's a really important message as well. So thank you for that. So inspired by Mella's work, we're launching our Protest Plastics Challenge today. Here's our learning assistant, Sarah Steele, to explain how to get involved.
Hi, I'm Sarah and I work at the Museum of Zoology. This year for Zoology Live, we are challenging you to take part in our Protest Plastics Challenge. There's a few ways to get involved. Number 1, pledge to swap one item of plastic from your everyday life to something environmentally friendly, such as ditching cling film or reusing jars or tubs, or swapping plastic washing up sponges to a biodegradable alternative. Number 2, another great way to get involved is by sharing what you learn with friends and family. You can do this by creating your own protest plastic sculpture using our salt dough recipe to build a display of sea creatures. Your creations can help you to share a message about what plastic gets up to when we're not looking. So join us in reducing the plastics we use for the oceans, wildlife, the planet, and for ourselves.
All the challenges that we're setting this week will run throughout the summer, so there is plenty of time for you to create your Protest Plastics sculpture and to share it with us. Now, here at the museum, we have some really fabulous underwater animals, from crabs and clams to sponges and squid. But perhaps most iconic and certainly biggest of all is our magnificent fin whale skeleton. As part of our recent lottery-funded redevelopment, this enormous skeleton had to be moved. Quite a daunting task for our collections manager, Matt Lowe, who will be joining us ready to answer your questions about this amazing skeleton, so do pop them in the comments. But first, here's a little taster of the story of our whale.
Our fin whale washed ashore in Pevensey in November 1865. Its flesh was removed at the beach to reveal its skeleton. The skeleton was purchased by the University of Cambridge, where it was put on display in the new Museum of Zoology. That museum was rebuilt in the 1960s, and in 1996, the skeleton was put back on display above the new entrance. Then, in 2013, with Nigel Larkin, Phil Rye and a team of volunteers, the skeleton was on the move once more. It was cleaned and the bones taken down. There go the ribs and the vertebrae. Now the tricky job of moving the skull. The skull was stored in his own purpose-built shed until the framework for the new whale hall was built. It was then craned in through what is now the end wall. And here is our whale skeleton today. It has baleen plates lining the mouth that would have been used to filter tiny pieces of food from the seawater. Here is its huge ribcage and paddle-like limb. It has no hind legs, but tiny remnants of the pelvis remain. And we can see that there is no bone supporting those broad, horizontal tail flukes that we would see in life.
So now I'm joined by Matt Lowe. Hello, Matt.
Hi.
So let's start with a few statistics about our fin whale skeleton. Just how big is this specimen?
It is just under 21 metres long, which makes it one of the biggest whale skeletons in the country. It's not quite as big as Hope at the Natural History Museum, which I think is 23 metres long, but it's certainly impressive enough. The skull itself is 5 metres long by about 2 metres wide, so that takes up a huge portion of the animal. And the skeleton and all the metalwork involved, so when you walk into the museum, that weighs somewhere in the region of 2.5 tonnes standing weight. So yeah, it's a big specimen in the museum, definitely our largest, I'm grateful to say.
So that kind of links to a question we've had from Henry, who says, yeah, how heavy is the skull and how long did it take to dismantle and rebuild the skeleton?
Well, it took, I think, 6 weeks in total to take the entire skeleton apart. And there's a lot of bones. There's about 60 vertebrae and about 30 ribs to contend with, as well as all the metal work. To take it apart took far longer than putting it back together again, because we had to clean it, of course, and we had to be very careful, and we had to clean it gradually, and that involved buying an awful lot of toothbrushes and getting an awful lot of volunteer help to do that. But the scariest part definitely was the skull, which took, I think, about 2 weeks in itself, just to build a platform underneath it, to hire a crane, to build a shed, to put the skull into. So it was a huge endeavour, and it's not particularly one I want to repeat very often, but thankfully we had an amazing team led by our freelance conservator Nigel Larkin, who just did an outstanding job on everything.
Yeah. So that links on to another question I had for you actually, which is, did you find anything surprising or new when you were moving the skeleton?
I was surprised by finding our endless reserves of patience and endurance, because it was a particularly long project with particularly long days. In terms of finding things with the skeleton, I found how great our volunteers were, because we were running behind schedule at one point, and it was to do with the cleaning of the bones. And I simply put out a call on our social media channels to our volunteers, and they all came in over the weekend and got us right back on track. We found a pigeon nest lodged up the nose of our fin whale, because for those of you who visited the museum before our redevelopment, it was actually hanging, it wasn't enclosed indoors, it was hanging partially outdoors, sheltered from the rain, but not sheltered from the pigeons. So we found a pigeon nest up there, we found a pigeon skeleton lodged between some of the plates, and an awful lot, I'm sorry to say, an awful lot of pigeon poo, about an inch thick in parts. So quite disgusting.
Yeah.
The best thing was that we were in touch with the folks in Pevensey and Norman's Bay, where the whale washed up in 1865, and we were talking to the local communities there, and they were very excited about the whole project. And somebody from Norman's Bay came forward with a piece of baleen which had been in their family since 1865, presumably from our fin whale, and they actually donated it to the museum, and it's now in the museum stores, it was just a wonderful find.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So a few more questions from our audience. Madeline asks, how are skeletons preserved? How are our skeletons preserved?
Well, skeletons are particularly tough parts of the body, and if you ask any paleontologist who looks for dinosaurs, you'll discover that bones are always the best thing to find preserved. Soft tissue and things like that degrades very quickly. Saying that, we do have to take care of the skeletons in the museum. We have a fantastic conservator who helps us all do that. So we keep the temperature and humidity in the museum at a constant level, or we at least try to. The whale, on the other hand, of course, was hanging up outside for a long period. So that's about monitoring and making sure that the whale stays good. But it is 150 years old, so we do have to keep a close eye on it.
Irina asks, how many bones are there? And I'm going to limit that to how many bones are there in our whale skeleton, because we've got an awful lot of bones in this museum in total.
I actually don't know off the top of my head. There are at least 60 vertebrae, at least 30 ribs. Goodness knows how many bones in the flippers. I would say somewhere in the region of 180 to 200. I don't actually know the answer to that. But the skull itself is composed of numerous bones inside, which made it very difficult to actually move because they were all moving against each other. So yeah, it's I don't actually know. I'll need to get out there and count.
Yeah. So if any part of the skeleton was destroyed or broken, do we replace it with a part that's artificial?
That's a really, really good question, because of course then you have to make all of our specimens in the museum are accessible and used by researchers, so any alterations we make to those specimens, we have to be very clear that these are alterations, so things aren't confused with real bone if they're replacements, for example. The only part of the whale that I can think of, actually no, there are two parts, is we had one of the pelvis bones replicated because it simply didn't exist. If you look at the whale skeleton, there's two tiny, tiny bones near where the pelvis would be, where you'd expect to find legs, which of course there isn't in a whale. We only had the right-hand side pelvis. We only ever had the right-hand side pelvis. So we scanned that and 3D printed it. And that's on the museum record to say that the left-hand side is a 3D replica, and it's painted to increase the display potential of that specimen. But we're very clear that it's not genuine and not real. The other part of the fin whale that's actually not part of the original fin whale is the baleen. So that's the filter feeding apparatus in the mouth. We know from photographs taken in the 1890s that our fin whale didn't have its original baleen, and at some point, not long after, within 10-15 years, some baleen had been put in. So we don't know where that baleen came from, which is why records are so important, which is why we make it so clear what we actually do to any specimen.
Yeah. So Julia, age 9, asks, how many people did it take to move and clean the skeleton?
Oh wow! It was a huge team of people. There was Nigel and Phil Wright, who primarily were working on it almost 24 hours a day. Myself, and we had at the time around 30 to 40 volunteers working right across the museum, and I think pretty much all of them chipped in 10 minutes here, a couple of hours there, and then we had countless contractors, so we had to hire a crane, and I don't remember now how many people came with that crane.
Quite a few, I think.
Quite a few.
Yeah.
But they winched the skull off the podium level of the museum and put it in a shed, and then there was a team of people who built the shed. It's almost like the lunar landings, you know, there's two people who land on the moon, somebody in orbit, and about 100,000 people behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So yeah, a huge team.
A big team of people. Jean asks, do you feel a spiritual connection with this fin whale?
Oh, I got a shiver down my spine just thinking about that. Yes, absolutely, because that whale has been hanging in the museum, or has been in the museum for 150 years. And when somebody says to you, you have to move it, that's absolutely terrifying. I can tell you, it's to plan logistically to do that, because you feel this connection with the history of the museum and all of the names associated with the museum and all the tens of thousands, possibly millions of people who've seen that skeleton over the years. And so when it was successfully put back together again, and that was in 2016, it went back together in 3 weeks, not 6. When the scaffolding came down, it really, really does, it gets you there to see it safely put back in its new home. And the year after, I had actually never seen a whale in life. I'd only ever seen whale skeletons, and so the following year off the coast of Argentina, I saw a southern right whale, which was 15 metres long, and definitely one of those life-affirming moments. Yeah.
That's a very spiritual connection there.
Definitely.
Noah, at age 7, asks, do you know why it was washed up?
We don't. There are a couple of theories. One is that it may have been harpooned as part of the whaling industry at the time, or injured in some way through a boating accident, because it may have been floating off the coast of Pevensey and Norman's Bay the night before it actually washed up. But we simply don't know the answer to that. It could have been an accidental stranding, maybe it was lost. I've read somewhere about it being harpooned, but I've not seen anything in the museum notes about that. And certainly at the time, fin whales weren't hunted. They were a little bit too fast for the boats at the time. It's on the very cusp of them starting to be hunted, so maybe somebody was having a go. But no, we don't actually know the reason, unfortunately.
We had another question. Were there any particularly delicate bones that we had to worry about?
Particularly delicate bones. As a particularly delicate collections manager worrying as we were moving things around. I suppose it wasn't so much, the bones are actually pretty robust because they're quite large. And so it was a case of making sure that we were very careful as we moved them. It's very easy when you're manhandling a rib through a door to go sideways and you know, not that we did that, of course. But some bones of the skull were particularly fragile, and the baleen, of course, is extremely friable because that's just a series of sheets, and so we had to be extra careful when we were moving those. But yeah.
Sumi asks, when the whale died, was it a full-sized adult?
It was just over 20 metres long, and I believe the biggest fin whale on record is 25 metres. So it was definitely in adulthood. It was a male, and we have, it was probably somewhere, it may have been up to 80 years old at the time. We're not entirely sure because we're relying on photographs and records at the time. It was almost certainly an adult because I believe calves are about 6 metres long when they're born. So 20 metres is definitely on the way to adulthood.
I mean, there are a couple of places where like the ribs and things like that have been injured as well, aren't there?
Yeah, we've got injuries to the ribs. If you go in and you look very closely, you'll see that some of the ribs bulge out a little bit, and that's often a sign that it's been tussling with other males. Perhaps it's been bashed in life. So yeah, we don't know how old it was, but it was possibly middle age, possibly older age.
Yeah, it lived a bit.
It has lived, yes, definitely.
Yeah. Roberto asks, do you have a nickname for this skeleton? I bet you have, so he says.
Actually, we don't. We don't have a nickname for him. He's just the fin whale. But I have seen online that he's been referred to as Bobby, which I don't know where that has come from. I've seen some newspaper articles in which the whale known as Bobby, and nobody in the museum has called him Bobby, as far as I'm aware, in my time. But yeah, Bobby's as good a name as any, I suppose.
You never wanted to nickname it Trouble or anything like that, given how much of a challenge it was?
There were plenty of choice names at the time, but nothing I'd repeat on air.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We've had some really brilliant questions today, and thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. That's fascinating. One of my favourite specimens. It's really great to learn more about it. So we're coming to the end of today's live stream. Do join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. for the final part of Zoology Live 2021, when we'll be taking to the skies to explore things with wings. We'll be joined by experts Professor Chris Jiggins and Matt Hayes, who are primed and ready to answer all your butterfly-related questions. And we will be watching for birds with our new Curator of Ornithology, Dr. Daniel Fields. Now, to finish today, we have a real treat. Some of our amazing volunteers are sharing with us their favourite sea creatures in the museum. So from me, I want to say a really big thank you to both Katie and to Matt, and to all of you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
In the upper gallery of the museum, hanging from the ceiling, there is a specimen which usually makes a big impression on visitors. Many children think it's a crocodile, or even a dinosaur, and you can see why they do. With its large teeth, powerful chest, and two small front limbs, it does look quite reptilian. Other visitors wonder if it's some kind of prehistoric fish, or maybe even a shark. It is in fact a male orca, or killer whale, as they are sometimes called. Many people would recognize an orca in the flesh, especially if they watch a lot of nature documentaries. But looking at just the skeleton of an orca is a different matter. It looks unfamiliar to us because the animal doesn't have its distinctive black and white markings, the very long dorsal fin, and the muscle and fat that gives it such bulk. Orcas are marine mammals and a type of toothed whale. They belong to the oceanic dolphin family and are the largest member in that group. They can be found in every ocean, being the most widely distributed of all the cetaceans. Orcas are powerful apex predators. They are also highly intelligent animals who live in complex social structures. In the wild, they can live for 50 to 80 years. Our orca skeleton in the museum is particularly interesting because of what it reveals about the evolution of whales. Early whale relatives originally had 4 limbs and lived on land before slowly evolving to become fully aquatic. Even though whales and dolphins lost those hind legs about 40 million years ago, 2 small bones can still be seen hanging below the spine of the orca, about 2/3 of the way down. These are vestigial pelvic bones, and they are an anatomical link to the time when the ancestors of whales once had back legs. You can also find vestigial pelvic bones in several other whale and dolphin specimens in the museum, including the magnificent fin whale hanging in the entrance hall. So when you visit the Zoology Museum, make sure to look up. You'll be amazed by what you can discover.
I've chosen the horseshoe crab. Why? Because it looks like it's from another planet and it's been around for hundreds of millions of years. To me, it looks like an alien. Its many legs surround its mouth, it has no jaws or teeth, and so uses those legs to crush its food. It also has more eyes than a spider, and blue blood, which traps germs. That's why humans test some vaccines and drugs with it. Whatever life form you think it looks like, to survive for over 400 million years, seriously outliving the dinosaurs, it's incredibly well adapted to its environment. Let's look after these ocean gems. Over the short course that humans have been around, threats to horseshoe crabs have been harsh. Laying millions of eggs which feed wildlife, having shells that are microhabitats for sponges, crabs and mollusks. Tell everyone how amazing they are.
My favorite ocean animal has to be the narwhals. You know, the unicorns of the sea. And perhaps what makes them most exotic are their 2 tusks. But before you start speculating, these are nothing but adapted canines. It's a more common feature among the males, and females rarely possess them. But even in the males, it's always the left one that is dominant, and rarely you see the right one. So that way, our specimen in the museum is quite exotic. We still don't know what these tusks are exactly for. Perhaps fighting between the males, or sensing their environment, or maybe just poking the fish. We'll let you know as soon as scientists have the answer. But apart from these two, their other teeth are not well developed, and they mostly eat soft-bodied animals such as squids, living mostly in the cool oceans. These are really cool animals of the sea.